Excuse me. So what is equity-oriented language, right? It's language that is connected to this idea of equity. And we wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about what is equity. I think we hear the word a lot, and may not have a great sense of exactly what we mean when we say equity. So equity, as you can see on the slide there, right? Equity is promoting justice, impartiality, and fairness within the procedures, processes, and distribution of resources by institutions or systems, right? So we all work in different spaces, education, VR, those are institutions and systems, right, onto themselves. And we want to make sure that when we're doing this work, that we're thinking about how we can be equitable, right, in the distribution of resources. How can we be equitable in developing procedures or executing or carrying out processes? So when you are addressing issues of equity and trying to tackle issues of equity, it really requires you to understand what is the root cause of the disparity that you're seeing, right? Where does that come from? So we don't want to just have a sort of surface approach to doing this work, but really understand what is causing the inequity. So we looked at the data earlier about the disparity between the teachers of color, right, and students of color. What is causing that disparity? Why don't we have adequate representation among the different groups and populations that reflect our students? So that would be an equity mindset, trying to think about that and then trying to address the root cause of the issue. And you see the graphic there on the right is the notion of equity, but we wanted to compare that to equality. So you can see on the left that everybody has the same step stool, the same size, right? Everything is equal. But if people are different heights, that doesn't help them reach the apple on the tree. So we have to give people what they need. And that may not always be the same thing. And sometimes that's a hard concept. But where the sameness comes in is that we want everybody to get to the same goal. And in this case, we want everybody to be able to reach the tree to get the apple. But maybe someone who is shorter needs a higher step stool to reach it. And that's okay. We need to start getting in the mindset of applying equitable approaches and giving people what they need to meet the goal or to, access the resource. And, as we move forward, another piece that we kind of wanted to talk about with this equity-oriented language is this notion of paternalism and moving beyond that. And so one way that we could kind of look at this notion is thinking about the savior complex. And it really is a deficit framing of, in this case, we're talking about communities, people that are living in poverty. It's a deficit framing of those communities, right? So those communities don't have, in the paternalistic approach, they don't have the ability, the resources to help themselves. It needs to be somebody outside of the community, right, that comes in, that saves the individuals in that community. In our case, a lot of times we're talking about youth or young adults. That person has to come in as the expert, as the person with the resources, as the person with the good heart, and come in and save those communities. And that is really a deficit frame, because we know that everybody in every community and every person has expertise in some way, in their own experience. They have a resource to bring, they have something to contribute. And so when we're operating in a more equitable way, we're making sure that we are including everybody at the table, and we are allowing space for people to bring their resources, their contributions, their expertise to the conversation, right? And co-constructing, a plan to help people move forward. If we delve in a little further and we talk about the white savior complex. It's when a privileged white outsider, again, sees there's their duty to kind of go in and save the poor, kids, children in a particular community. And I wonder, just a quick thing as I'm kind of finishing up this conversation, you can put in the chat, can you think of any movies that have an example or are examples of that savior complex or that white savior complex? You can put it in the chat. There are a lot of movies that, I, like other people, enjoy, but it really does. Somebody put The Blind Side, Dangerous Minds. Yes, absolutely, you got it. And so, I think with The Blind Side, I think when they interviewed Michael Orr, he was saying that, I knew how to play football before I went to that family, right? But that wasn't what was kind of portrayed in the movie. The Help, there are other movies that have that. So we want to make sure that when we're doing our work, that we're not coming into the space in that way. Because the young people that we work with, their families, they will see that. They will feel that. They will have a reaction to that. And so we're going to talk more about other equity-oriented terms and give you the opportunity to kind of think about your own practice and how to make sure that you're using an equitable frame and then also not engaging in the savior behavior. And so I'm going to pass to Betty Ray, and she's going to continue this conversation about deficit language.
Thank you, Dr. Mitchell. As we have heard thus far in the presentation, our central focus today is on equity-oriented language. And the first slide that we shared with you demarked the distinction between equity and equality. The last slide focused on this notion of the savior complex, right? You have the savior complex where anyone can participate. People of color can participate in that savior complex. And then you also have what's called the white savior complex, which is specific to white individuals operating from that mindset. There are other important language distinctions that we want to draw upon in our short time with you all today. And we like to kind of call this segment avoiding deficit language. When you're working with marginalized communities, or if you're working with communities of color, there's certain language that you should be made aware of. And so we are sharing this information so that everyone is on one accord. You don't want to use language in a setting with a youth or a family or even within the community that signals to them that you see them in a deficit light, right? And so we're going to share just a few of these terms with you during this session now, and we have a resource available after this presentation that really gives a deeper dive into the specificities of the language that you want to use to make sure that you are using asset-based language and language that everyone, or mostly everyone, the majority of everyone has come to acknowledge and accept. So here, real briefly, I want to give you an example of a simple way that oftentimes we confuse language, and it signals or sometimes missignals the wrong messaging. And so when we're referring to people, we want to say the intersection of identity, right? And oftentimes we hear people talk about intersectionality when they're referring to people with multiple identity markers. We know that we're not a monolithic group. No one is just a woman, or no one is just, Black, or no one is just, and you name the identity in that bracket, right? No one is just, no one ever is just one identity. But oftentimes when we talk about the multiple identities that we carry, we often refer to that as intersectionality. And the difference between intersection of identity and intersectionality is something that a lot of people don't know. When you're talking about multiple identities, you refer to that as intersection of identities. That means you could be male, you could be white, you could be Christian, and you could be of a higher socioeconomic status, right? But specifically, when we talk about intersectionality, which is a concept that was coined or popularized rather, by the scholar Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, who does a lot of work on Black feminism, intersectionality is really used to talk about the overlapping identities of marginalized individuals. So in this sense, when we use intersectionality, we are really talking about women of color who may identify as a member of the LGBTQ plus community. And, you know, Black males wouldn't necessarily, in this sense, fit under the understanding of intersectionality because their male identity is not necessarily considered marginalized. So again, pulling from the research and the scholarship of Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, we understand intersectionality to be more specific to women of color that carry other marginalized overlapping identities with them. And so that's the clear distinction between intersection of identity and intersectionality, which oftentimes we hear being used interchangeably. And that's why we're here to provide some context to why equity-oriented language is so important. So moving beyond people, now we want to consider communities, right? And so when we're thinking about communities, we often sometimes say, oh, poor communities, when in actuality, we don't want to put a label on individuals that they really sometimes systemically have no, it's fault finding in some degree. So we don't want to label a community poor per se. Instead, we want to refer to the community itself as under-resourced or low income, highlighting that systemically, these communities may just not have access to the appropriate resources. And we see this all the time, definitely in subsidized housing communities as well. And so here we're just distinguishing some of the common language that we kind of use and we don't necessarily reflect on to really understand the implications of the language that we're using. So we just wanted to bring that to your attention. And again, after this session, we will be providing additional resources for you all to look through that provide a deeper dive of some of this equity-oriented language that we're presenting to you all today. And again, consistent with this notion of poor, I also wanted to highlight when referring to people, we don't call people poor. We don't believe that there are poor people. We believe that there are people that experience poverty. So just again, making sure that we are delineating language in a way that is not perceived as deficit. Okay, when we think about bias, everyone cringes. They're like, I'm not biased. And, you know, it's one of those words that have come to make many of us uncomfortable. But here, when we say bias, we want to make sure that we're all, again, on one accord and on the same page. And we define bias as being characterized as stereotypes about people based on the group in which they ascribe to or belong to. And sometimes bias is based on immutable physical characteristics that a person may possess or their gender or identity. There are 3 common types of bias. There are, more beyond this, but these are the 3 most common. First, we have anchoring bias, right? And this is a tendency to take the first piece of available information and unconsciously use it to anchor all of our decision making, right? whether, the information is incorrect or prejudiced. We look at someone and, that first thing that we discern about that person, we use that information to anchor everything else that we think or perceive about that person. The next common type of bias is confirmation bias, and really is an intricate process, which we'll talk about in just a few moments, where the brain has a tendency to search for and focus on certain information that only supports what they already believe. So the brain is not open to receiving countering information when you're operating in confirmation bias. If anything, your focus and your intent is solely on finding information that only validates the biases that you may hold. And of course, last, I'm pretty sure all of you all have heard this reference to implicit bias. And according to Dr. Eberhard, implicit bias is a distorting lens that's a product of both the architecture of our brain. Again, we're going to talk about some brain functioning in a second, but we promise not to bore you, and the disparities in our society. So really drawing on Dr. Eberhardt's definition of implicit bias, we have a little activity that we want you all to participate in with us today. Okay, so before we engage in this activity, I want to make it very clear, as Dr. Eberhardt says, that implicit bias is not another way to say racist. With so much of this, these politically charged, dialogues that we've had most recently, but dialogue that has long existed for ages, but that just really took front and center during, this dual pandemic, we refer to as, the virus, COVID-19, and the other very much pandemic of racism. We heard a lot of rhetoric and dialogue about what it means to be a racist, and, what do you do to be anti-racist? And sometimes what gets conflated in these conversations is that racist means that you hold implicit bias, or that implicit bias, rather, is just another way to say that you're racist. And we're here today to debunk that myth, because everyone has implicit bias. But before we kind of detail what we mean by suggesting that everyone holds implicit bias, I want you all to take a moment and participate in this activity. The video commentator will tell you exactly what to do, and we are going to use the chat option to record our responses to some of these questions. And so if you're ready, I am going to click on this video, pay very close and careful attention to what you're instructed to do, and everyone get ready.
Count how many times the players wearing white pass the ball.
Are you counting? Get ready. How many times are the players in white counting the ball, throwing the ball? I hope you're counting. Are you watching closely? Awesome.
Count how many times.
So I want you all to take a moment and insert your responses into the chat. So how many times was the ball passed to the players in white? How many times did you all count the ball being passed to the players in white? 13, 15, awesome. 13, 10, nice. 12, 16. Y'all keep those answers rolling in. 14. Any more guesses? Amy says she's seen this video before, so she can't participate. Actually, I would beg to differ, because I'm not sure how the video was used before in a previous session, but I would bet that it's not being used the same way that we're going to use it. 14, 17, but I thank you for your honesty and transparency. 17. Mary Summers said she's seen it too. Awesome. I wonder if you all saw it during the watch party that we had last May. Okay, awesome. So even if you've seen this video, I wonder, did you see the gorilla? How many of you all saw the gorilla? Yes, yes. Everyone saw the gorilla. I hope it's not social desirability because everyone's saying, yes, they saw it. Like, if you really didn't see it, it's okay to say that you didn't see it. Nope. Yes. Thank you for being honest. Okay. For those of you who did not see the gorilla, I wonder, did you see the curtain change colors in the background? How many of you all saw the colors change, the curtains change color? Ah, interesting. Not too many people saw that. Monica saw it. That's very good. Mary watched this video before and she didn't catch that. Interesting. Okay, last question. Did you see the player leave the game? At any point while you were watching, did you see a player exit the game? No. Some of you all did, but most of you all are saying no. A few of you all are saying yes. Oh, you all got great attention to detail, mostly. And it's okay that we missed a few of these things. So just in case you all didn't see the gorilla, just in case you didn't see the curtain change, and just in case you did not see the player exit the game, we're going to replay the same video.
Let's rewind and watch it again. Here comes the gorilla, and there goes a player, and the curtain is changing from red to gold.
It's all there. So when we say that everyone, regardless of race, gender, or socioeconomic status, is susceptible to implicit bias, this is true. And this takes a non-threatening activity such as the monkey business. And it really highlights what we mean when we say implicit bias. When we talk about anchoring bias and confirmation bias and implicit bias, all of those things, while they are distinct, they're not mutually exclusive. They operate in tandem and overlap with one another. And so I beg the question of you today to consider, are there some things that we don't notice about our students because we're so focused on other things? Case in point, how many of us really look at students who are not necessarily typically perceived, or whose grouping does not necessarily associate with giftedness, right? How many of those students are often overlooked, right? Because we're so focused and honed in on only one identity, right? And inversely, I would beg to say, are there some things that we hyper focus on with our students, right? Like discipline. We just learned from the first session, and we had a recap today that emphasized that Black students receive significantly more out-of-school suspensions, despite their behavior not being any worse than any of their white peers or any peer for that matter. So Black students can participate in the same behaviors as some of their peers, but yet and still receive more punitive sanctions. So again, I beg the question, are there some things that we hyper focus on with our students? And that was something that we learned from this video. Because your attention was told to only focus on those players in white that passed the ball, we didn't see some of the other things that happened in the video that was just as significant, like the color change, the gorilla, and the student leaving the game, or the player leaving the game. And so think about, reflect for a moment what this means for you as a practitioner, right? As an educator. Are there things that you've missed? Are there things that you hyper focus on? And we should give more consideration to that. So I will digress. as you all ponder those questions, and I will pass the torch over to my colleague, DJ.